So I've been watching a ton of TFT streamers play the new set on the PBE, and I thought, why not in today's video, I share with you guys the top 5 compositions that I saw players playing today on the PBE, and also explain a little bit behind how the compositions actually work so that you guys can also learn the set alongside with me. But this is a new format, so please let me know what you think about it in the comment section below, and I guess we can just hop right into it. But the first composition I want to talk about today is going to be vertical piltover, or 6 piltover, played by robinsongz. And in that composition, I thought it's pretty cool that one, you get to play around the T-Hex, which is finally making its return since I believe set 9, and you get to play around some pretty interesting decisions with your piltover mods. Although once you lock into a piltover mod, you cannot change it. I also thought it was really interesting because in this game in particular, he had a ton of emblems that he had to play around in order to really navigate the game properly and make sure that his board was strong, because the portal itself was trainer emblems, I believe is what it's called, where you get 3 emblems that you get to throw onto your units. Generally speaking, in this current set, from what I've noticed so far, is that emblems are a lot more frequent than they have been in previous sets, which I believe was an intentional decision made by Riot. So you've got to really make sure that you understand your emblem game when it comes to what is craftable, what is not, and if that emblem in particular has a certain effect. Now, in this composition, there are a couple of important unlocks. The first one we're going to talk about is going to be the 2-cost Orianna, who is a caster where you have to field 3 piltover units or higher in order to unlock her. This can easily be done by using units like Loris, Vi, and Caitlyn, but with the emblem, you can just do Vi and Caitlyn, who are 2 and 1 cost respectively, Loris being a 3 cost, which is a little bit harder to find in the early game. The T-Hex is the other important unit they have to unlock, who is a legendary where you can unlock with 9 piltover star levels. So as long as you have piltover on your board and you get to upgrade the units, most of the time that should be enough in order to unlock the T-Hex. Seraphine in this composition does tend to be the main carry, but you can also eventually cap out by using Azir, as they are both disruptors. Azir is also really nice as well because Azir is just a really strong 5 cost that also lets you unlock more strong Shuriman units as the game progresses, whether that be Nasus, Renekton, or Xerath. All of them can be good and flexed in one way or another. Now, we did touch upon the mods a little bit earlier, but let me give you the general rundown. I think tomorrow's video that I have planned in mind is that I'm actually going to cover all of the piltover mods for you guys. But let's give you the general gist. There are 17 piltover mods in total. 13 are combat based, 3 are utility, and 1 is sort of a special case. It's called Echo Engine. Basically, you get to repeat the effects of the previous mods that you have chosen, and they repeat every 10 seconds. But the majority are combat, and the reason being is because the piltover trait itself doesn't actually provide any type of combat power. Instead, all of your combat power is inside the modules themselves. So generally speaking, you do want to try to click on the combat ones specifically. In the game that Robin played, he specifically chose Continuum Cogs, Upgrade, and Micro Rockets, and I'll explain what each one of these do. Continuum Cogs, basically all allies gain mana regen and some AP. The second one, Upgrade, a random item on a piltover unit will be upgraded to a radiant item, and they will also get a little bit of attack speed and HP. Finally, there is Micro Rockets, where a barrage of missiles that repeats the damage dealt by piltover units as magic damage by a percentage, and as the numbers are right now in the PBE, I believe it is 66%. Yep, there you go. And again, there are a ton of mods, and we'll do another deep dive another time, but that is what Robin decided to choose. As you could tell, they were all combat mods. Another point I wanted to point out is that Robin also decided to take exiles in his specific game, which is generally a pretty solid augment. You can't get the full value out of it, only just because the T-Hex specifically kind of works like Renekton from set 14 if you played in Cyber City, where he will actually consume the unit behind him, and it will act as a pilot for the T-Hex, and by doing so, it will actually unlock some specific abilities. The trait itself is called Hexmech, where you can read all about it. In his game, he specifically made sure that Orianna became the pilot. By doing so, it actually gives the T-Hex extra mana regen because she is a caster. Now, whether or not this is the best unit to be eating, I'm not entirely sure just yet, but that so far seems to be what Robin believes is the correct choice. I don't believe that there are going to be stats for the T-Hex specifically, but if you watched your favorite pro players as the set progresses, you will see that people will have a certain default for sure. And again, based on the star level and that role of the unit that's getting consumed, it will have a different effect for the T-Hex. And we can quickly look over them, but generally speaking, tank gives omnivamps, fighters gives AD, marksmen give damage amp, casters give mana regen, and assassins give crit chance. Now again, which one is good or bad, I'm not entirely sure myself, because it does also depend a little bit about the way that you itemize the T-Hex if you choose to do so. Now, Exiles, again, was a pretty interesting choice in this line in particular because you have so many things on the board. You have your Sand Soldiers, you have your Frozen Towers, and it looks like you're getting almost very little Exile bonus, but that's not actually the case here. But remember that Exiles only applies to your units. It does not apply to summoned allies. So things like your Sand Soldiers, things like your Frozen Towers, these will not actually grief your exile. So by putting things like your Sand Soldier here in the Frozen Tower here, it's actually okay because your units themselves are actually spread apart so that they still get the exiles bonus. The only ones that are not getting exiles here is T-Hex and Oriana because these two are actually units. Neither of them are necessarily summons. And again, there are a ton of emblems in this set. You really got to know how to navigate them and know what each of them do. In Robin's game in particular, the piltover and the failure emblem don't actually really do much besides give a little bit of stats. Piltover and I believe failure as well only give 150 HP, but Warden has a fairly interesting ability where the holder gains the Warden trait, and when a shield on the holder breaks, you heal them for 30% of the shield's initial value, which is quite a lot. Now, when I was reading this Warden ability, it does kind of remind me of Mordekaiser from set 14 as well, actually from Cyber City, with Chassis and Vanguard emblem, where he became a Giga tank because you had the correct emblem and mod setup. Now, I don't know off the top of my head if there is any sort of specific combination that sounds really good with this Warden emblem, but reading the ability, I would not be surprised if there is some broken tech out there that utilizes the Warden emblem, and I urge and encourage you to try and explore it for yourself. And the one last thing to note, this was Robin's board on level 8 if you want to try playing something similar yourself. Again, there were a ton of emblems, so it might not look exactly perfect, but this was the 6 piltover and 3 failure board that he was playing on level 8. The next composition I want to cover today is going to be a game played by prestivent earlier today, and that was a very interesting Disruptor Juggernauts board. He primarily played into this line because he got so many Disruptor emblems at the early game that he was like, I have to play around this, because he had 2 of them, which are elusive, by the way. So by having these, he was like, I gotta play around the Disruptors. Now, if you don't remember the tree itself, Disruptors contains Echo, Gwen, who's an unlockable champ, Malzahar, Seraphine, Azir, and Mel, who is also an unlockable champion. The spell itself works very similarly to Dazzlers from back in set 10, where the Disruptor's abilities will dazzle enemies hit, and the Disruptors deal bonus damage to dazzled enemies. But dazzling itself means that you are reducing damage dealt by 10%. Now, dazzlers overall are really nice because they're kind of buffing each other up. By making sure that units are dazzled, your disruptors will do more damage. So things with AoE are going to be really nice for you. Units like Seraphine and units like Mel. And the line that Preston earlier played today, there are a couple of important unlocks that you got to remember. The first one being Rise. He actually played Rise in this line as well because he had so many slots. And in order to unlock Rise, you have to field 4 Origins. The next one is Xerath, who is unlocked by playing Azir on your board and then alternating between wins and losses. Now, how many times you have to do that depends on the number of Shirimans you have already unlocked with Azir. If Xerath is the last unit, I believe it is 5 wins and loses in a row. But if it's your first one, then I believe it's only 3. Mel as well needs to be unlocked here, and she can be unlocked by having a 2-star Embeza with at least 1 item die in combat. And then finally Poppy, which we'll go over a little bit later as to why Poppy wasn't unlocked, but Poppy can be unlocked by using Demacian or Yordle fielded with 2 items. Now, this was Prestivent's final board in the game itself. As you can see, it's a lot of really interesting cohesion going on with all of these units, with Xerath and Rise kind of being the primary carries here, but Seraphine was actually item holding for quite a bit of time until the very last round when Prestivent found Xerath too. Now, Rise and Azir is going to be a very common combination that you're going to see on a lot of endgame boards because Shurima works so incredibly well with Rise's ability, where if you have Shurima unlocked, then Rise's ability will actually knock up units, providing a little bit of a stun, but also have the opportunity to dredge loot if he manages to kill them. Now, as for the gameplay itself and how Prestivent actually got to the state of the game, he actually had a very flexible and pretty cost-efficient level 8 board. He actually took reinforcement on his 4-2 augment, getting a Swain 2 fairly early on, and actually utilized a Malzahar 1 in order to get all the way to level 9, because he found himself not losing too much HP throughout stage 4, despite losing the majority of the fights. Now, again, like the previous game that Robin played, there are a handful of emblems that are at play here. Things like the Warden emblem, things like the Juggernaut and the Disruptor emblems, where the Disruptor emblem actually does have an ability where the holder gains the Disruptor trait, but then also their abilities deal 30% magic damage over 3 seconds. He also found a Juggernaut emblem as well, where the holder gains the Juggernaut trait and 10% of other Juggernauts max HP when they die. So it's fairly interesting that there are so many emblems. Again, this is going to be a very common trend that we see, And Prestivent in his games in particular found these because he took Legion of Threes, a brand new gold augment where you gain an emblem, but your 3 cost and emblem holders get some attack speed and HP. But he also took a prismatic called the Trait Tree, where you gain 3 more random emblems and some gold. But overall, a really good cook from Prestivent nonetheless, a really cost efficient level 8 that let him get to level 9 in order to cap out so high. Now the next board we're going to talk about today is going to be one played by none other than kurumx, who played a very interesting bilgewater bronze for life flex board with a lot of interesting stuff going on. Now in case you're a little bit out of the loop, bilgewater has been a bit of a hot topic recently in the high elo community because of a recent tweet made by Sologasong, and I'm sure most high elo players have already kind of figured it out at this point. Bilgewater has been kind of on the come up because people have realized that you can use these silver serpents that you farm from the trait in order to get more econ and generate more copies of specific bilgewater units, and the highlight of all of these units is going to be Gangplank. By utilizing these bilgewater serpents, you're able to get closer to the quest in order to unlock Tahm Kench, whose quest, which we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but in order to unlock him, you spend 500 silver serpents. But on the way there, you're able to buy copies of Gangplank, buy mini duplicators for bilgewater units, and etc. And by doing so, you can actually kind of omit from rolling on 7, and instead, you can actually just keep pushing your tempo, pushing your lead, and eventually as the game progresses and you get enough silver serpents, you're able to get that Gangplank 3 and still have an absolute grand time with a super strong unit on your board. Now we did touch upon unlockables a little bit with Tahm Kench, but one other important unlockable to remember is Graves for that early game, and he can be unlocked by fielding a TF with 2 items. He is integral for your early game because by having a Graves early, you're able to get 3 bilgewater in on 2-1 essentially, and by doing so, you're able to already start stacking up those silver serpents, making it easier for you to find that Gangplank 3 as the game progresses. What you're seeing on the board does have 9 units on the board, but that's just because that Kurum actually had coronation this game, and this was his level 8 board. But getting to this point required item holding Graves overall in order to get to this like level 8 decently comfy board. There's not so many things going on here, but it was enough to be stable in order to get to level 9. As for your backline carry in this line in general, you don't actually have to go for MF. 5 bilgewater just happened to be what was most comfortable and what seemed to fit in very nicely for Kurum's board in particular, but you actually can flex into kind of whatever. As we can see on his endgame state, he did have units like Azir, Lucian, and Senna, and using those to actually try and help the Gangplank as well. Now in his game, he actually ended on GP2 because he was contested, but the idea was to get to GP3 and try to go for a first. Now, as you can tell on the left-hand side here, Bronze for Life came in super clutch this game because it gave so much value, but this doesn't apply to just this board. And actually, this set in particular, Bronze for Life is going to be a very strong augment because this set is really trying to reward players for trying to activate as many traits as possible and trying to pump a little bit of power from each of those origins to try and build a super strong board. Most of the power that was in the traits from previous sets came from the high verticals, but this set in particular, as the Riot team has discussed and as Mortalk has discussed as well, is that they are trying to put a lot of that initial power in these small early bronze traits. That way you're able to play a ton of them and really try to flex into multiple different type of compositions and units and boards. Now, one last thing I want to cover before we go on to the next board are the bilgewater items. Now, there are 7 in particular that you can order from the Serpent Shop. We'll not go over all of them, but I want to go over this one in particular that came up during his game, and that one is Captain's Brew. I think this is the one that's going to confuse a lot of folks. In Kurum's game in particular, he actually opted out of building a Morello because he saw that attacks and abilities burn and chill enemies for 3 seconds, and he had that on his MF, and so he kind of assumed that he had anti-heal in his board, but that's actually not the case. Burn is not the same thing as anti-heal. Burn is dot damage, basically damage over time. But wound is actually the anti-heal and cuts the effectiveness of healing items by 33%. Now, how can you remember the two? Because they're often paired together. Well, wound, you can think of like, I have a wound, and that is making it harder to heal. I wounded myself. That is how you can remember that wound is anti-heal. But if you just see burn and burn alone, that is going to be extra dot damage over time, but that is not going to be the same thing as anti-heal. You still need your red buffs or your Morellas or your Sunfire Capes or wherever it may be where you're getting your source of anti-heal. But now that we covered that, the next composition I want to talk about was played by none other than Escha from OCE, who played a pretty interesting Noxus reroll board, but I will admit it did not look too hot, but it looked interesting. I think that's what's most important about this board. This is the first reroll board we're going to cover today, which was a Draven 3 Darius 3 reroll line, and it actually contains quite a lot of important unlocks. What you are seeing is his endgame state board. But in this line itself, first off, Darius requires Draven to farm at least 1 gold. In order for Draven to farm at least 1 gold, he has to stack 11 stacks of adoration, where he gets 1 per takedown or 2 per kill if Darius or Draven gets 1. So that does mean that's going to take a little bit of time in order to get those adoration stacks before you're able to actually unlock Darius to reroll him. Mel as well is a fairly important unlock from this game, where in order to unlock her, again, you have to get a 2-star M-Pesa with at least 1 item to die in combat, which is fairly simple, but a great way to cap out this board within Noxus. Now, the main carries in this line, as you can probably guess, are going to be Draven 3 and Darius 3. And the reason why there are Hodges on these units in particular is because of Escha's augment Retribution. This is a brand new prismatic augment that gives you 2 Hands of Justices, and any unit that's holding a Hand of Justice, their ability will also be able to crit. Generally speaking, when it comes to itemization for units like Draven and Darius, for Draven, you want things like your Ginsus, your Kraken, think about Ash items back from set 15, and for Darius, you want things like your IE, Hodge, and Sterax, or Titans, or whatever it may be. So as you can guess, Retribution actually fits fairly nicely into this line overall, and I think it's one of the best augments that you can take for this line. Now, one thing I wanted to mention though is that it did seem that it was very difficult to fit 7 Noxus in without feeling like you're cutting something important, and as you can tell by his endgame board, it did feel like it kind of sucked not having Quick Striker on. Ideally, you want to get to level 9 and then be able to play that on top of a defender. That way you're buffing your Darius and you're also still buffing your Draven as well. Ideally, that Quick Striker being Kindred, but on level 8, it does seem that I believe Escha made the correct choice in dropping Quick Striker and just playing the Draven without it. Now, I do want to mention though that I think this comp actually has some potential to cap super incredibly high, and that's around Sejuani specifically. I do think that's possible that when playing this line, if you can get to 9 or you feel like you are finding the right copies, you could potentially switch out the Sejuani for instead a Silas, where if you don't know, his unlock condition is to sell a 2-star Garen, a 2-star Lux, and a 2-star Jarvan. Now, you don't actually have to field or play these units. You can actually just buy them, keep them on your bench, and sell them as soon as you find the upgrade. So by doing that, you could actually just try to make some progress towards Silas and play him as your final unlock and try to go for a board like this that caps out super incredibly high. But again, it's very difficult to get to that point, and I think more often than not, if you do try to play this line, you're not going to really be able to get to that point. But again, the comp overall just looked okay right now with how the numbers stood, but I do think though, if this comp gets a bit of a buff, I could actually see it being a decent meta contender, but it definitely isn't there just yet. Now, the last board I want to talk about today was a very, very fun board played by none other than Dank Memes, which only consisted of 2 units, Aurelion Sol and Brock, and he still went first. So let's actually talk about how he actually got to this point, because obviously you can't just throw Asol and Brock on your board and expect to win every single fight. So the way that we got there was playing Ixtal and Targon together. He got a very early on Ixtal emblem, which allowed him to play Ixtal starting from 2-5 and still be able to cash out a Brock with fairly decent odds. Now, in the line itself, I will mention that there are a couple of important unlocks. First one is Diana, where you have to field a 2-star Leona with 3 items in order to unlock her. But unlocking Diana is super important because you need to have Diana on your board in order to unlock Asol, and Asol can only be unlocked by fielding 5 Targon units at the same time, aka every single Targon unit available before Asol. And then finally, with Brock himself, in order to unlock him, you have to collect 500 Ixtal Sun Shards, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can actually do that. But again, Dank Memes was able to slot in 3 Ixtal fairly early on, and he was able to play into some Ixtal quests in order to garner up the Sun Shards. You get more Sun Shards as you do more Ixtal quests. Now, I do want to mention something that is pretty interesting is that the Ixtal quests are not necessarily all lose streak focused. Some of them are things like you can actually win streak in order to try to complete the quest, or there's some other ones which are like, for example, you want to roll X amount of gold before you're able to complete this quest. That means that it's actually very possible to play Ixtal while still preserving HP in the early game, and that's actually what we saw Dank Memes do very, very well. Now, one thing that I think is nice to point out is that, again, these quests, you don't actually have to do them them immediately. If your ixtal quest says lose 3 combats in a row, you don't necessarily have to do that on that turn. If you're on a win streak, you can still keep streaking and then wait until you lose naturally before you start to try to cash out that ixtal quest. Dank Memes actually ended up playing quite a lot of quests that weren't necessarily lose streak focused in the early to mid game, but then by the late game, he was looking at those lose streak quests because he knew his board was going to fall off and that he had to look for those anyways. Now again, by getting to 500 Sun Shards, you're able to unlock Brock, who is an incredibly strong attack fighter, but by no means is he an insta-win. But the way that Dank Memes was actually able to insta-win this game was by actually stacking up Aurelion Soul. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's because of the way that Aurelion Soul's ability works. Now with A Soul, as he casts more and more, he gains more Stardust, and Stardust makes his ability more powerful. Once you get to 1200 Stardust, you basically insta-win the game. So the item priority when you're thinking about units like Aurelion Soul are things like your Shojins, your Ginsus, your blue buffs, because you want this guy to cast as much as possible to stack up Stardust to really make his ability super duper strong. But with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this video was fun. I hope this was helpful, and let me know what you think about this new format, and if we get a lot of good reception about it, I'll definitely do more in the future. But that's it from me. Project PBE, the games for the ladder grind where the points start to really matter start on the 24th. So I hope you get to see your favorite streamers participating in it. And with that being said, thank you guys. Take care. Happy cloud.